As you can imagine, we're a diverse crowd here, and we have a diverse range of beliefs and convictions. I hope you have come with an attitude of learning, of seeking to consider, and hopefully also with an open mind to better understand convictions and beliefs that are different than your own. And I think both of our speakers will challenge us with that today. I would like to now introduce Dan, who is going to be our moderator for the evening, and he will talk a little bit about how this evening will run.
Sure. My name is Dan Byrne. I'm also with the Dig and Delve Servant Team and a pastor here at the Ottawa Chinese Bible Church. And I'm excited for this evening together. Dig and Delve Dialogue. We're not looking at a formal debate format, but we'd like to give each one of our speakers an opportunity to speak on the topic of meaning without a maker. Does life have, or is there a fruitful search for meaning with or without God? And so Dr. Guiness is going to speak first. He's going to be speaking for about 25 minutes. Dr. DiCarlo will then be presenting. They'll each then get a 5-minute opportunity to response, and then it's turned over to you guys, and you will be able to text questions to me, and we'll just be having a dialogue discussion up here together for the remainder of the evening, the rest of the time. So without further ado, I invite Dr. Guiness to share with us.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dan. A great delight for me. This is my first time in Ottawa, and I've heard nothing but wonderful things about my conversation partner, Dr. DiCarlo, so I've looked forward to this evening enormously. Let me just tell you why this topic means everything to me. 20 or so years ago, I was diagnosed with a brain tumor. Fortunately, as you see, it turned out to be nothing. But when I was in a Washington hospital, I was about to go under an early MRI scanner, and the nurse said to me, "Are you claustrophobic?" I said, "No." "But why do you ask?" She laughed. She said, "Well, we call it the coffin machine." I laughed too, but when I was in it the first 2 times, I couldn't help thinking of what she said, and the first time, lying in the darkness with a clamp around my head, it was as if my entire life scrolled down in front of me in Technicolor. I've lived in various continents and met various fascinating people, and I had an absolutely vivid sense of the journey of life and the search for meaning. And after that, I've tried to read and think along those lines of life as a journey, obviously beginning with the quest for meaning. I want to make 3 relatively simple, straightforward points. First, where I think Dr. DiCarlo, Chris, and I will agree, I trust. Secondly, where undoubtedly we will not agree. And thirdly, an area where I hope we may agree, although many Christians and atheists at the moment do not seem to agree. Relatively simple points. But first, where I think we will agree. Socrates famously said that the unexamined life is not worth living. If he's right, many, many people in the West are living lives not worth living. For all sorts of modern reasons, people are not thinking and caring enough about reaching an examined life. And that's what we're talking about tonight. So don't take our words on many, many points. We'll make points. But think it through for yourself and make sure every one of you comes to a place you can say, this is my warranted faith, whatever it is, and this is my convictions on an examined life, what it means, the good life, etc., etc. And I hope on that we will strongly agree. Why don't people think? One of the main reasons given today is what Blaise Pascal called diversion. People would rather surround themselves with busy, entertaining distractions than think through ugly realities like death at the end for all of us. Any of us may suffer, all of us will die. People would rather not think about that, so they surround themselves. And as people put it today, psychiatrists say, we're living with weapons of mass distraction, smart devices, and so on. And more people in our generation simply don't think enough or care enough to think through the meaning of life. Another reason I come across is what's often called bargaining. People just say, well, later, when I've graduated, when I've got a more solid job, when I've paid the mortgage, when my kids are a little older, when I'm retired and have a little time to read and think, oh, it's later, 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 and finally there are no more laters. And then, of course, you have something like Marlowe and Goethe's Faust figure. And the devil comes in and offers us a little later, but of course the devil's read the fine print, and most people haven't, and the laters run out. And so many people never get round to leading an exam in life because they've just put it off and off and off and off until it's too late. So I imagine Chris and I both agree strongly that it is incredibly important, particularly in our world today, to have an examined life, because the faith, the philosophy, the worldview that we choose will be of immense personal significance to us in terms of our identity, our ethics, our prospects for life, but more than that, at a time when our entire civilization is increasingly at stake, these issues make a tremendous difference, not just to individuals, but to entire societies and potentially even to the global world today. So I imagine we'd broadly agree on that, the challenge of all of us. So don't take our words for it. Anything intrigues you, you go home, think and wrestle and come to your own good conclusions. Where do I expect we will not agree? Well, obviously, if I understand things rightly, and I don't know Chris very well, we've only just met this evening, I am a follower of Jesus. I am not a faith head, as Richard Dawkins calls it. I have what John Polkinghorne, the great physicist, who's also a Christian, calls a warranted faith. I'm a follower of Jesus, and I understand Chris would call himself a former altar boy and an atheist. We will obviously differ. If you start to look for the meaning of life, many people in the past tended to look towards science for answers, but it doesn't give answers to the why. They looked for art for the answers, but very few people today would claim that art gives the answers. Eventually, you'll begin to look to the big philosophies of life, the grand world views of life, the religions, whether supernatural or secularistic. And when you do, some people are immediately paralyzed. They say, how on earth can I look at all the options? But for all practical purposes, while there may be 1,001 potential answers in the room, for all practical purposes, there are three big families of faiths, as the philosophers put it. Faiths which have a common family resemblance because they go back to the same understanding of the ultimate source of reality. And if you see it that way, the big three are the Eastern, the secularist, and the Abrahamic. The Eastern religions, obviously, and we have no representative of them tonight, go back to the understanding of an impersonal ground of being. So whether it's the Hindu understanding or the Buddhist understanding, they would agree on that, and their answers as what is humanity and what's the goal of life all flow out of that particular understanding. The second great family of faiths, I'll let Chris speak for that, is the secularist. Atheists, agnostics, naturalists, materialistic, most of them going back to the ultimate ground of being, chance. Chance plus time plus matter, and so on. The third great family of faiths is the Abrahamic. Supremely in our Western world, Judaism and the Christian faith. And you go back to a personal, infinite God, an infinite personal God. And once again, everything flows down from that particular understanding. And of course, that's where many of the differences come from. So people begin a search when life raises questions and gets them thinking. They believe something before, but life is called into question, and what they believed before no longer satisfies them, and they become seekers, searchers, looking for a more profound form of meaning. So the first stage of the examined life is always that time of questioning, a very valuable stage. Sadly, as I said, many people don't even get that far. The second stage of life, logically, if someone has a question, is to look for answers. That sounds very simple. But that stage, of course, is rather conceptual. A question has come in so that a person sends the mind out like a scout to look for potential answers to answer the question that life has thrown at them. It's the conceptual stage. If I were to believe that, what difference would it make? This is also a critical stage. Because when someone adopts a faith, a philosophy, a worldview, it's like putting on lenses. There are things you see more clearly, according to that worldview. There are things you don't see at all. For example, you can see, as many historians point out, Hinduism never produced science. Its view of reality as Maya or illusion didn't give a grounding for the engagement with the world of science. Or you could say the same thing about human dignity. In other words, you see certain things, you don't see other things. So it's very important that you choose one that is adequate and illuminating, that really casts light on all the questions that life gives. The third stage, of course, is a time for evidences. Someone has a question. They're looking solidly for answers that they hope are adequate and illuminating, but then they don't just jump into the arms of whatever they come across, but really, with due diligence, as the lawyer says, justification, as the philosophers say, checking it out, as the plain person says it, people look at a worldview to see if they are convinced that it is true. Very, very important stage. And certainly for followers of Jesus, a fourth stage would be a time for commitments. Questions lead to answers, which lead to the investigation of truth. And finally, someone is prepared, not just in their minds, but as a whole person, to commit themselves to the logic of what they're now convinced is true. And that, of course, is when faith becomes experiential and becomes deeply real. Someone search for God, and in a very deep way, they discover that God has found them. Now, of course, I imagine much of the argument between us is at this particular step, on second or third stage. Which of these philosophies of life is the most adequate, is the most illuminating? And then moving on to the question of truth. I've had the privilege in my life of meeting a whole series of very famous atheists. When I was a student, I took seminars under Bertrand Russell and heard his explanation of his secular and humanist worldview. Grand old man. Later I knew Arnold Toynbee, the great historian. When I was at Oxford, I had a train journey, a fascinating train journey, all by myself in the compartment with Professor A.J. Ayer, the great hero of logical positivism, and another dogmatic atheist. When I worked for the BBC, I had the dubious privilege of interviewing Madeleine Murray-O'Hair. Much of the interview was a rant from her side that made the eyes of the reporters in the BBC absolutely rolling in dismay when they listened to this. And more recently, I met and began to get to know Christopher Hitchens. And sadly, the friendship we hoped to have and the conversations were cut off by his cancer and his death. So I have a great respect and a great admiration for the great atheists. And in my own journey to faith, I read Nietzsche, and I try and read something from Nietzsche every single year now. And my own particular hero earlier was Albert Camus. I read a good deal of Jean-Paul Sartre, but I found him rather cold and bloodless compared with Albert Camus, who had a passion and a warmth about his atheism and his existentialism, which was incredibly appealing. So I have an enormous respect and appreciation. But not only that, I fully recognize today that in our Western civilization, it is the secularists, the atheists, who are in the elite positions in the universities, in the press, I worked for the BBC, and the media. And so many of their views are influential beyond their numbers because in many ways they're defining reality, creating agendas, setting fashions, and so on. And I respect that too. But I would go beyond that and say that knowing history, I have to say with sorrow as a Christian, that both individual atheists, but also the whole movement of secularism, is partly the responsibility of the church. Atheism became aggressive after the great age of dissimulation at the time of the Renaissance, where theological correctness was far worse even than political correctness today, and it wasn't worth many people's life to say that they were atheists. And you can see that many people, including the state theologian in Venice, behaved one way in public as Catholics and another way behind the scenes as closet atheists. And it was the church's things like the Inquisition or horrendous notions like error has no rights or the coerced baptism of the Jews or whatever that really forced their atheism to be as aggressive and reactionary as it was. Now, that is not only true of individuals. Bertrand Russell would always say that it was his Christian grandmother, when as a precocious teenager he would raise questions like, what is mine? Doesn't matter. What is matter? Never mind. And she gave these little cliche-ridden stock answers to squelch his thinking. And here he was, a brilliant mathematician and a philosopher, just simply not allowed to think. And you can see with many of the great atheists, Bertrand Russell, Spinoza, and many others, it was the church which helped create the aggressiveness. I'm Irish. Chris is Italian. If you look at Ireland today, many of you have seen the film Spotlight. There is an anger against the church because the church was egregiously vile and sub-Christian in its behavior, and it's created a massive revulsion against the Christian faith in Ireland, the former land of the saints and scholars. Or you take France. Diderot's cry, the world would never be free until the last king is strangled by the guts of the last priest. You can see what he's reacting against. In France, you had a church and a state, the throne and the altar, both corrupt, both oppressive, and both in collusion. And the revolution, 1789, threw off both. And the militant laïcité you have in France today is a direct reaction to corrupt, established churches. I would go further and say, as a social science, most of European secularity gains its strongest arguments from its reaction to corrupt churches. You haven't had that in North America until recently, but you can see the same signs in, say, the United States with reactions against the follies and the extremism of the Christian right. In other words, we've got to be honest. Much of the anger and aggressiveness of atheism is something that Christians have bred by not really being followers of Jesus in their behavior. In other words, our hypocrisy has created much of the belligerence of atheism, and we have to say with sadness. Just recently I was talking to someone from the south of the United States whose father was a Baptist deacon. And he was an angry atheist. Why? Nothing to do with God at all. But his father had violently abused his mother. And all that he felt about his father, he'd projected onto God. And you can see that story multiplied again and again and again. And those of us who are Christians have to say with sorrow that we understand that, and the church has been wrong. So, that surely is the place where we have our main discussion. But I want to say, in my own search for faith, and in many I have talked to myself and read, what were the inadequacies of atheism and secularism at that stage of the search, which meant that people didn't go that way, or they were atheists and turned away from it? For me, there have been principally three. First, realism about evil. That sounds unusual. Theodor Adorno was famous for saying, after Auschwitz, there cannot be a God. Actually, as Viktor Frankl pointed out, more people deepened and discovered their faith in Auschwitz than lost it. And you can see that in the death camps, the one group that was significantly unable to handle the horror, the malignancy of evil, were the atheist intellectuals. And many of the great converts to the Christian faith, like C.E.M. Joad or W.H. Auden, the poet, were people for whom evil was not the rock of atheism, but something that eventually pointed them towards God as the only deep answer. The second area I found in my own life and talking to people is human dignity. When I was talking to Bertrand Russell, he would say, well, of course, we as humanists believe in human dignity as strongly as Jews do, Christians do. But that's highly argued against today. You have philosophers like John Gray who point out that much of the humanism was parasitic on the Jewish and Christian notion that humans were made in the image of God, and that by themselves they don't have the foundation for that. And you have some of the Harvard atheists and so on talking about the uselessness of dignity, the stupidity of dignity. And one of the saddest things today, when human rights are so precious and important, is to seeing so many atheist intellectuals scrambling to find a solid view of why you can ground human dignity, why someone who's totally handicapped, completely uneducated, has no privileges of educational wealth at all, still has a precious, inalienable dignity. Jews and Christians would say, because made in the image of God. Evil, human dignity. For me, the third thing, practically, both for myself and many that I talk to, is freedom. I live in America. I'm not American. The so-called land of the free. Freedom is called into question today as never before. And as you look at our atheist friends trying to justify it, many of them can't. Sam Harris, one of the four horsemen, freedom is an illusion. But once again, where do you get the notion of human dignity with freedom goes back to the biblical record and flows from the understanding of the difference that God makes. So that second area, where we undoubtedly will disagree, terribly important because it affects so many profound things, starting with ourselves. A few words about the last one. An area where Christians and atheists at the moment are not known for agreeing, but I firmly believe they should. In fact, I believe we should be co-belligerents. The great challenge of our time is to build free, open, responsible societies, and especially to know how we live with deep differences when those differences are profoundly ideological and religious. One of the world's great questions for the future. We're given two options in most countries. Some countries plump for a sacred public square where one religion is preferred, established, or even a monopoly. Everyone else who doesn't share that religion is second class or maybe have their lives endangered. Take, say, the Baha'i in Iran, or Christians in Pakistan, or atheists in Bangladesh. That, I think, is not just and free for everyone. I'm a strong opponent of the so-called sacred public square. The other extreme is what's called the naked public square, where many secularists are trying to remove all religion from public life, often bringing their own faith through the back door in the process. Now, there are mild versions of that, and there are very strong versions of that, say the Chinese and the North Korean. And again, most of the world is incurably religious, far more than 80%. And I'm certainly with people like Jürgen Habermas, the great European atheist, who argues for liberals to deny religious voices in the public square is highly illiberal. And yet, in America, and some of your Canadian voices, there are people arguing for the naked public square, which is simply not just and not free for most people. Neither of those extremes are right. The alternative is what's called a civil public square, where everyone, based on freedom of conscience, is free to enter and engage public life on the basis of their worldview. Christian, atheist, Jewish, Mormon, Muslim, name it, you name it. But within a framework of what is understood to be just and free for others too. So we know how to negotiate differences persuasively and not violently. Now, that's utopian in the sense that it's no place. And yet it's a view that's now being argued for as the only way forward for our Western world. And many of us think the only way for that to happen is for Christians deeply committed to their faith and atheists and secularists deep committed to their worldview to stand together on matters of freedom of conscience for people of all faiths and no faith. And I believe in that area we can be co-belligerents and partners for the sake of free, open societies for tomorrow. But finish with this thought, and back to the differences between us, but just a thought. I mentioned Jürgen Habermas, probably the most famous European atheist. He wrote a fascinating essay after he'd been to a funeral of an atheist friend, and his friend had wanted his funeral in a church, but wanted no sermon, and he said, "No amen." And Habermas, reflecting on this, said, "I have a deep awareness of something missing." And it was picked up in a discussion on the final inadequacies of atheism to provide a fully adequate answer to the full range of life. And you can see now the trend towards, quote, atheist religion, which would have been an oxymoron 20 years ago. Not very lasting, not often very satisfying. Look at the fate of Kant's religion. But you can see why scholars like Christopher Lasch, for example, said the only substitute for religion is religion. And the great historian of atheism, Peter Watson, said very simply, the fact is there's an insufficiency and an awkwardness about atheism practically. And then, quote, he said, it is simply not fitting the bill.